there's the bell. The only announcements I know about are that Jorgensen is still recovering at home, and Papa Joe's here tonight. Where's Papa Joe? Okay. It's good to have the Ellises back with us tonight, so it's good. And it sure is good to have air conditioning. Just for the men, remember the men's breakfast will be next Thursday, not tomorrow morning since it's the 4th. This week we is a little bit of a different tone. We're going to talk about Nehemiah and his prayers on behalf of Israel. And it's about, he's upset, rightly so, because the walls have not been rebuilt. Israel has been returned home or been allowed to return home. Many of them had not by their own choice. But the walls were still down. And in this day and time, this time period that Nehemiah lived, a city that didn't have a wall was without defense. That was a city of any size was absolutely. Give me a little more volume, Tim, please. Thank you. A city that didn't have any wall. Thank you. Didn't have any walls was pretty helpless to any marauding bands, and so, and then this is one of the things that's hard for me to, because of the way the books are laid out. Ezra and Nehemiah are really the last recorded history of the Old Testament. They stop around 400 or so before Christ, and there's no more written history in the Bible for the time period until John the Baptist. And so it's hard for me sometimes to get that through my mind that there's a lot that happens in that 400 years of, some people call it 400 years of silence. But there was a lot going on, I'm sure. It's just not recorded for us. God didn't see fit for us to have anything recorded for us at this time. There is a timeline on your handout that I just wanted to show. It's just something to think. It's something to think about. And of course, anybody who studied history knows that getting a date before Christ, even during the time of Christ, getting a date is extremely difficult because they didn't use a calendar. They would say in the 3rd year of King so-and-so. And so the historians have to kind of put things together and count back and kind of figure it out. So even among conservative Bible scholars, there's going to be some disagreement about certain dates. And it's just because it's hard. When Moses was writing Leviticus, he didn't say on June 14th, the year before our Lord, 6,000 or whatever. He didn't write things like that. They didn't happen. But starting there in the year 711 BC, Isaiah prophesied that Cyrus was going to turn the Israelites loose. He prophesied that and names him. And as you go on down, Israel really lost any power long before this happened, because there were several times that there were deportations that people came. So like in 605, Nebuchadnezzar came. He had defeated the Egyptians, and he took a bunch of people to Babylon with him, and that's when Daniel left. And most people think that Daniel was around 14, 15 years old, just a kid, just a youngster. And so and again, conservative Bible scholars like Burton Kaufman and the man who wrote Truth for Today commentary of Daniel both think that he lived till he was about 80. And it's just their educated guess on reading the historical accounts that they can get their hands on. And so if you start counting down, there's a lot going on. And Ezekiel was taken shortly after, but Ezekiel prophesied amongst the captives on the river Where was Daniel? He was there in the same time period, but where was he? He was in the palace. And so God saw to it somehow, some way, that there was someone in the capital to influence things on behalf of his people, and then Ezekiel to preach and teach the people, the captives who were encamped around the river Tigris and Euphrates, just in time. And so it goes along, and then if you look here, Daniel is probably still alive when Cyrus in 539, 538 says Israel can go home. There are some Bible scholars, again, that think that Daniel had some influence on him. The guy that wrote, and I lost his name, but wrote Truth for Today commentary, he thinks that Daniel may have said to Cyrus, he said, by the way, did you know that Isaiah way back here said that a guy with your name is going to turn the Israelites loose? It's all speculation. To me, the thing for us to get is that God saw to it that there were people in place to look after his people and to make sure that they got back home. How all that worked, how the Spirit moves, if you read Ezra 1 and verse 1, it says that Cyrus was moved. How was he moved? I don't know, but he was. And it wasn't that God came, spoke from the heavens and said, you got to turn these folks loose. It's not how it happened. Now, right before that, remember Daniel in Daniel chapter 5 read the handwriting on the wall and says, tonight is your night, your last night. And that very night, Babylon fell. And so he's there. Then during this same time period, you got Haggai and Zechariah who are prophesying to the people and encouraging them to finish the temple, finish their work, and preaching to the people. And then shortly thereafter, Esther becomes queen. And we know what happened during Esther's time. Haman tried to destroy all the Jews, but through her influence, the Jews were spared. And again, it was important because it was preservation of the lineage of the Christ. And so as you look at this, it seems at critical junctions, there was somebody in place, somehow, some way, who could influence things. To me, it's the same thing. How did Joseph get to Egypt? His brothers. But how did that all work out? I mean, it was important for him to get down there, wasn't it? How did God used wicked people in that case? And at the end of Genesis, Joseph even says, you meant it for bad, but God meant it for good. And he said, I don't hold this against you because it's all worked out. So all these critical junctions, something happened. And so right after Esther, the next king that comes along, Nehemiah, uses his influence with him to go back and rebuild the walls. And that's the story for tonight. So it's just interesting to me to see that these guys they overlapped, their work overlapped, these men and women, their work overlapped, and maybe they weren't in the same exact location, but their work overlapped, and they were doing their part to preserve the Jews because of the lineage of the Christ. And when we studied Esther, it was important because if all of that remnant had been destroyed, it's very possible that the family of Mary and Joseph would have been destroyed also. And so God, through his providence, through his influence, however he made those things happen, to Esther and Mordecai to influence policy in that government to make sure that the Jews were preserved. And it was a great preservation, and they celebrate that to this day with the Feast of the Purim. All right, and so just so you see, then later on, Alexander the Great conquers them, and then later on, the Romans conquer him, and so not too long after that. So turn in your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 1. And again, I'll be watching the YouTube channel for anybody that makes any comments. We've got a few people tuned in. So in Nehemiah chapter 1, the first 11 verses. So it gives the time, the month in the 20th year we don't know 20th year or what exactly. If it was his 20th year, he was 20, whatever. He was in Susa, the capital, and one of his brothers from Judah came and he asked him about the Jews in verse 2. And in verse 3, they said, they are in great distress and reproach. And I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. The wall, and it continues, the wall is broken down, the gates are burned with fire. In verse 4, he says, I heard these words, I sat down and I wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, and then he shares what he writes down this particular prayer. I beseech you, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now, night and day, on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we have sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote part of the heavens, I will gather them from there and will bring them to the place where I have chosen to cause my name to dwell. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great power and your strong hand. O Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight to revere your name. And make your servant successful today and grant him compassion before this man. Then he says, now I was the cupbearer to the king. How important was the cupbearer to the king in these times? Kind of between life and death. And Lynetta, you had very important, yes. He was the guy to make sure no one poisoned him. And if you read through the history of Persian kings, that's how there was transition of power. You know, we have elections to transition power. They had poison, and they used it frequently. Even the Romans. Can't even think of the name I had in mind. The one who persecuted the Christians and executed Paul. Nero, thank you. His mama poisoned his predecessor on his behalf. So it was common to do that. So anyway, cupbearer is very important. Kept him alive, made sure he wasn't poisoned, to the point that many times they had to take a drink first. So you wanted to be, if you're the cupbearer, you wanted to be absolutely sure that wine was safe before the king drank out of it. So it's important. So it's somebody he trusted. So he gets bad news, and it's bad, really bad, and the walls are bad. So how often do you think he was praying, weeping, mourning? It says many days. How often? It says day and night, many days. This is the time period from the time that he got the news to the time that he was before the king, that we'll see in the next section, was about 4 months. I feel like, based on this description, that he was constantly praying on behalf of the children of Israel because they were in such a bad place. And so that's one clue to his dedication. Who did he say had sinned? Everybody. He even included himself. I and my fathers, we have sinned. Some of the crucial, he acknowledges God is supreme. He expresses faith. He shows faith that God will keep his promise. He acknowledges their unfaithfulness. And he asks God, you know, it's kind of like, do you remember what you said you would do? You know, it's kind of like a real kind of a timid, I would kind of word it kind of timidly. Do you remember what you said? We've been really bad. However, you said if we'll, and do what? Come back, yes. And so he asked him to do that. And basically he's asking for mercy. Okay, so the situation is he's got a very important position. More than likely, Daniel was probably the son of a noble, a high up person. Probably Nehemiah was also. They wouldn't just take some sharecropper out of the digging ditches and move him into the palace and have him serving the king's wine. Nehemiah was probably from a family of influence also. So he would be attuned to the proper etiquette of being in the palace and in the presence of the king. So in chapter 2, so it came about in the 20th year, the month of Nisan, the wine was before him. I took the wine and gave it to the king, and I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. I'm going to stop right there. If you're the guy that's supposed to make sure the king doesn't get poisoned, and he looks at you and notices that your personality has changed, you have reason to be afraid. If he notices, because his first priority is to keep himself alive. And he can get rid of you and get somebody else like that. And so Nehemiah had good reason to be afraid. If the king's getting a little nervous about him, when he's handing the cup and he says, "What's wrong with you?" Yes, he has reason to be a little scared. However, so he said, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and his gates have been consumed by fire?" So from this, I can see that there was a good relationship between the king and Nehemiah. Otherwise, this conversation might have gone differently, because the king could have called his guard over there and says, "Take him out." But instead, he has a conversation with him. And so the king says, "What do you want?" Again, Nehemiah prayed. In the book Prayers of the Bible, he called this a shark prayer, meaning it's got to go quick. It's like, I got 30 seconds here. So he lifts up and makes a quick prayer to God and says, "I need some mercy. I need some help. Help me do this right." Whatever that is. He said, "So I prayed to the God of heaven. I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." So he makes his request, and he asks it in a very polite and humble way. He doesn't say, "Look, you need to let me go." He doesn't, none of that. And so he asked politely. So he asks him in verse 6, "How long will you be?" He gives him a time in verse 6. And then he continues, he says, "Let letters be given to me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river." It's a long ways from Susa to Jerusalem. It's a long ways. He's got to travel through several areas. Persia was huge, huge. When Queen Esther was in charge, it took about 30 days by horseback to cross the kingdom. And a horse can travel pretty good time. They actually had kind of a Pony Express themselves to disperse messages out across the kingdom. And so they were very organized. So he asked for letters to go, because Joe Blow, 150 miles away from the capital, could care less probably who Nehemiah is. Okay, yeah, you're the cupbearer. Sure you are. But if he has a king with the king's seal on it, that's going to guarantee him safe passage. And so he asked for that. And he asked for a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's force, that he could get timber to make the gates. And the king granted them, he says, and Nehemiah gives credit in verse 8. because the good hand of my God was upon me. Nehemiah never ceases to give credit for God. He never ceases to ask God for his favor and his strength and his help and his encouragement. And so in verse 9, so he came to the governors and he presented the letters. And also the king, in verse 9, sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. Then Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, heard about it. They were displeased that someone. So he prayed for about 4 months. I've already mentioned why would Nehemiah be afraid to tell the king. And we've already mentioned that Nehemiah was polite and respectful. What would have happened if an armed troop of men had come upon Nehemiah and said, "You're not going through here"? What would have happened? What would have happened? What would have happened? Who was with Nehemiah? Who did the king send with Nehemiah? An armed troops. So if somebody had confronted him, they would do what armed troops do, is follow their mission. Their mission was to get Nehemiah to Jerusalem. And so if you interfere with that, you can either step aside or else. The Persian army was very well trained, and they knew what their mission was. Just like the horsemen and the foot soldiers who were assigned to take Paul down to Caesarea. What would have happened had someone tried to kill Paul? They would have died. And so God uses civil government. He uses whatever we may feel about these people, wicked, not wicked, however we want to place them, God uses them to accomplish His will. The purpose was to get Nehemiah to Jerusalem. However you want to word that, think about it, justify it in your mind, those soldiers were going to get him to Jerusalem because they were not going to go back to the king and say, well, we didn't get him there. It was not okay. Soldiers follow orders. God uses ordinary people and ordinary men to accomplish His will. There are many times in the Old Testament when I would consider these not God-fearing people, God used them to accomplish His will. They probably didn't even know they were accomplishing God's will, but they were. And so, to me, it gives me cause to be encouraged that no matter what happens in this world is crazy. It always has been, and it will continue to be crazy. That God is going to see to it that we'll get through. His church will be established forever. And if we are faithful, like Nehemiah and these, then it's going to work out. It may not work out the way I want it to work out, but it's going to work out. And so Nehemiah's purpose was to get there to rebuild the city because God needed Jerusalem preserved, because whose ministry was going to be there? Jesus. John the Baptist's ministry was going to be there. So, in the Truth for Today commentary, the writer believed that there was reason to believe that the Samaritans and the people in that region were rebelling and restless and causing trouble. And so the king saw an opportunity. You know, if my cupbearer there and he's doing things on my behalf and he's got things kind of under control, it's going to kind of settle things down. It's going to be a friendly group of people there instead of these Samaritans who aren't really doing what I would prefer that they do. So anyway, sure he was. Sure he was. He's a politician and he wants to remain in power and he wants his way. That's what they do. I compare, so why did the king agree to this? He's going to have to spend some money. He's going to have to send some troops. Why did he agree to Nehemiah's request? True. So your question is, did the king realize the immenseness of the task? Kings really don't think about the immenseness of the task. They have people for that. It's like, you go, no, they have people for that. And so, now I've given you on your handout Ezra 1:1 just because to me it sounds kind of like the same thing. In Ezra 1 and verse 1, the first year of Cyrus the king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus the king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout the kingdom and put it in writing. And that proclamation was to let the Israelites go home. How did that happen? What spurred him into that? The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus the king. It's rhetorical, huh?
It's the handwriting and the prophecies. Even though he was a king, they still understand prophecies.
True.
Which side of the fence you play on.
True. He didn't have to know, did he? The prophecy of Isaiah was 150 years earlier. There are some who speculate that Daniel had something to do with that because God used his prophets and his teachers to do things. There's some that speculate, says, Daniel said, by the way, did you know that the prophet Isaiah 150 years ago said that a guy by your name, I don't know. That is pure speculation on his part, and he readily recognizes that, and it's speculation on my part and your part. There are times that we are not going to understand how God made things happen. We are just not. One of my favorite songs is, "We know not how the Spirit moves." What's the next phrase? Convincing men of sin. We don't understand. We will never understand. Why do two people hear the same message and you get two completely, we don't know? Sean, you got it figured out?
Nope.
You got it right. And get three different answers, right? Yes. Yes. Exactly. Maybe three different answers, 6 different ways. Yes. There's just things we're not going to understand. We accept things by faith. We understand that God is going to, one of Orrin's favorite all-time sermons to me was, God's going to get his way. God is going to get, how he's going to get his way is beyond my comprehension and your comprehension. We don't know. All we know is that Isaiah and Jeremiah both said Israel is going to come back. Jeremiah said, you're going to leave, you're going to be gone 70 years, and you're going to be back. And God made it happen. How he made that happen, he stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, and how he stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, maybe someday we'll know. But right now we don't. So he's given his request. And so to me, the deal is we got to keep praying. Nehemiah prayed and prayed and prayed, and he kept on. So he got it, his request was granted. So in chapter 2, verse 11, I was just checking the time there. He came and checked out the gates and the walls and saw how bad it was. And you skip down to verse 17. He talks to the people. He said, you see how bad it is. Verse 18, he says, the hand of God has been favorable to me. And so they got up and they decided, yes, we can do it. Nehemiah prayed. He asked. He was given the opportunity, and so he took the opportunity. Did God build the wall? No, he did not. Nehemiah built the wall. because he acted upon the favor and the grace that God had given him. So when we pray and when we ask and our prayer is granted, we got to follow through, right? We got to if we make the promise and we make the request and God grants that request to us. I know that there are many of us here that pray about people that in our family that we're concerned about, and we keep praying and we hope that someday it'll happen. And we just got to keep praying. But when the opportunity comes, we got to take it, right? So,
But he knew before he left that God was going to make it happen, but that he had to do some things. That's why he asked for timber for the gates.
yes.
He didn't expect God to make the timber appear.
You mean there wasn't just a sawmill down there ready for him? No. It was. Exactly. So Nehemiah took the necessary steps to make happen what he asked God to let him do. So he did his part. So we have to do our part, right? So, adversity. First they mocked him in chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. They mocked and despised, and so his answer to them, God has given us success. If you skip down to chapter 4, they told him in verse 3 of chapter 4, what they are building, if a fox should jump on it, he would break their stone wall down. That's how weak that wall was. If a fox ran across it, it'd fall over. Again, Nehemiah in verse 4, Hear, O God, how we are despised. Return their reproach upon them. So he turned and prayed about the response he was getting again. Do not forgive their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out before you. Then that didn't work, so they turned to threats of violence. They conspired in verses 8 of chapter 4. They conspired to come and fight against them and to cause a disturbance. But in verse 9, we prayed to our God, and because of them we set up a guard. And so in verses 16 through 23, you see everything that they did. They armed themselves. They set up guards at night. They assigned a group of men to walk around and patrol and guard and protect, and they assigned a group of men to build the wall. Nehemiah responded on his faith and on God's granting him his request. He did his part, and the Israelites did their part in response to the prayer, God granting their prayer. And so they were, in fact, it says in verse 23, they didn't even remove their clothes, and each man took his weapon even when he went to get water. Everywhere they went, they took their weapons, so they were under constant threat. And in chapter 6 and verse 9, for all of them trying to frighten us, thinking, but again he prayed, O God, strengthen my hands. So, as we kind of bring all this to a close, they mocked him, they made fun of him, they threatened them. So was it righteous, was it okay for Nehemiah to say, you bring this sin upon them, you punish them for that? Is that a righteous act? Sounds like something I'd say. Now, George, you said that real nice. Hold them accountable. Yeah. Do they know that, though? Do the Samaritans know they're fighting God? Nah, they don't care. They just want their way, right? When I read that part, it kind of like, is that really the best thing? It's something I would want to say, and I probably would think, if you're keeping me from doing what I want to do, and you're fighting me, and I'm trying to do the right thing.
Paul said Alexander caused grief. Take care of it.
Yes. Well, he said God. Yeah. So, I just kind of asked that question to stir up trouble, really. That he did say, God, you handle it. That's probably the best way to put it. Okay, I'm going to do my part, but God, you deal with them. I'm going to carry my weapon, and I'm going to make sure no one comes and tears down what I've already got. But you handle them and their sin. If he trusted God, why did he need to set up a watch and carry weapons? Got to do your part, right? Again, God is not going to build the wall. They have to do their part. And I think that's the message through all of this. And so, in Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 15 and 16, so the wall was completed on the 25th month, in the 25th of the month Elul, in 52 days. That is amazing. That is amazing that they were able to do that. So to bring this lesson home, Nehemiah saw a need. He acted on that need, and he prayed. His first thing was to pray to God for help, to make something happen, to allow him whatever it was. And so when he had the opportunity to do something, he acted on it. When the king says, "What's going on with you?" he took his opportunity and made a statement, and then he asked for the reasonable amount of help. He asked for supplies. He asked for letters to allow him to transport through, and the king sent the troops to make sure that he could get transported through, and to make sure. Now, of course, some of you might ask the question, well, where were the troops when they were building the wall? We don't know. They may have, their job was to get him down there. Their job may not have been to keep things safe while they were there. I don't know. So, Ernest, did you have your hand up? Well, they had to. Yeah. Yes. I don't know if I'd say that, because, I mean, they went from mockery. First they mocked them. Well, first they just said, you can't do this. Then they mocked them, made fun of them, and then they threatened them. I don't know, I didn't see any place in there where the Samaritans and the Ashdodites and all these people acknowledged that God was accomplishing this. I don't know. But I didn't see anything where they did. Was there something that kind of piqued your interest on that you saw, that you thought they might? Oh. Well, that's Nehemiah talking, isn't it? Oh, okay. Yes, I got you. After it was done, after it was accomplished. Yeah.
Of course, the other thing is they couldn't really do much to him because he was there on behalf of the king. The king had sent him down there for letters. So they also had to, play within the lines.
True. Because if they'd have crossed the king, what would he have done? The rest of the army would have showed up. Yes. Okay. All right, the last question. Were there any miracles performed in any of this? It was a question Karen and I were discussing on the way to church. Would you say there was a miracle involved in any of this?
God's hand was within it.
Does that make it a miracle? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? What would you say that Cyrus being stirred up, the Spirit stirred his spirit, was that a miracle? It's kind of... Do what? It was? Yes. But did you anywhere anywhere in here did you see a miracle? That's a tough one, isn't it?
The 52 days getting that done.
That's that's pretty. Yeah, that's a pretty good miracle. The reason I say that is, I wouldn't say there's anything in here that is a miraculous event in that the laws of nature were suspended, like crossing of the Red Sea, crossing the River Jordan, the sun going backward on the steps for Hezekiah. Nothing that I see like that, but God's providential care to see to it that things are going to happen. If Jesus said his church was going to stand forever, my kingdom, it's forever. The church is not going to be destroyed. How does he make that happen today? Do you have any thought whatsoever that some government would be able to come in and remove all the Bibles and take the Word out of the hands of the people? Is there anything makes you think that's possible? Not to make Debbie?
It certainly happens in individual countries, but there will always be a deliverer. There will always be somebody somewhere that has it and have the opportunity to fix it. Syria is breaking. They moved all the Christians out of Syria. China has, you can't bring, you're not supposed to bring a Bible into China. But there are a lot of the rest of the world that does have a Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, can it happen in any country? Yes, I do think it can happen in any country. But it will never be to the point that there's not somebody that can preach the word.
Yes, I agree. I agree with you to a point, except that there's always in the back of my mind, I wonder, have they really exterminated every Christian, or are they just gone into hiding? We don't know, do we?
We do know in China that they find you with the Bible and you're going
Yes, that's true. Right. Well, and the Christian Chronicle published an article about the church that meets in Saigon, and they kept everything secretive and everything. They move their location every month, and they don't tell anybody else. They don't have a sign, and they change their location monthly, and they keep everything a secret. And I think there's like 10 of them. There are millions of people there.
I do think, again, in any given region, sort of like this God going silent for 400 years, like the Old and New Testament, there certainly could be places that there could be silence.
Oh, and certainly by the activities of the people who are living there, yeah. George?
Well, even, when Elijah was trying to say he was all by himself, God said, no, I've got 7,000 men have not bowed before, Baal. And so there's always going to be a remnant somewhere that will still hold to God's plan.
Mm-hmm. I do agree. There are places in the world where you're just not gonna find them. I mean, good grief, Karen and I were up north and had trouble finding a church to worship with here in the United States. But as far as eliminating the word and eliminating the churches, we have confidence that that's not going to happen. And I think that's part of that providential care. One of my favorite Beatitudes is, if you hunger and thirst for righteousness, what does it say? You shall be filled. That's a promise. If you are searching, hungering, looking for righteousness, I believe that God is going to find a way, somehow, some way, for that person to get taught. Somehow, some way. That I am unshakable on that. There are just certain things that God is going to make happen or not allow to happen. So anyway, next week we're going to cover Jephthah, who made a vow with, Ernest, I'm sorry.
History, Christianity is
Well, sometimes the so-called people that were Christians were worse than the barbarians they replaced.
Christianity was what destroyed Rome.
So we should thank Charlemagne for making Christianity.
I wouldn't say that Charlemagne is the example we need to be living by. Anyway, next week, I'm gonna dig out of this ditch I'm in. Next week, Jephthah is gonna he's gonna pray for success, and he's gonna make a vow. And we're gonna talk about that prayer and that vow next week. I appreciate the comments and the questions and everything. So it's a good class. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.